The murder of Sydney Loofe. Imagine going on a Tinder date. It seems normal enough. You match with someone attractive. You chat for a while. You agree to meet up. You tell your friends where you're going. You're careful. You're not naive. The first date goes well. You agree to a second one. You send a Snapchat to your friends showing you're having fun, giving them a thumbs up. You seem happy, excited even. That Snapchat is the last time anyone sees you alive. This is what happened to Sydney Loofe, a 24-year-old woman from Lincoln, Nebraska, on November 15, 2017. She went on a second Tinder date with a woman named Bailey Boswell. She sent that final Snapchat around 6 p.m., smiling, signaling everything was fine. By the next morning, Sydney was dead, her body dismembered and scattered across rural Nebraska. But this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a date gone wrong or a robbery turned violent. This was a carefully planned murder orchestrated by a couple with a twisted, codependent relationship built on manipulation, domination, and dark sexual fantasies. Bailey Boswell was 23 years old, attractive, charismatic, the kind of person who could convince you to trust her. But Bailey was under the complete psychological control of her boyfriend, 51-year-old Aubrey Trail, a career criminal and con artist who believed he was building a sex cult and needed to sacrifice someone to gain supernatural powers. Together, they hunted for a victim on Tinder. Together, they lured Sydney Loofe to her death. Together, they dismembered her body and scattered the pieces. And when they were caught, they turned on each other, each claiming the other was responsible, each revealing the depths of their psychological dysfunction. This is the story of Sydney Loofe's murder. It's a story about how predators use dating apps to find victims. It's about the psychological dynamics of criminal couples, how one person can manipulate another into committing unspeakable acts. And it's about a young woman whose trust was exploited, whose life was stolen, and whose murder revealed a relationship so twisted that even seasoned investigators were shocked by what they discovered. Sydney Loofe was born on July 2, 1993, in Lincoln, Nebraska. She grew up in the small town of Neligh before her family moved to Lincoln when she was a teenager. Those who knew Sydney described her as kind, gentle, and caring. She had a sweet nature that made people gravitate toward her. Sydney worked at Menards, a home improvement store in Lincoln, in the receiving department. She enjoyed her job and was well liked by her co-workers. She was responsible, showing up on time, doing her work well, maintaining friendships with the people she worked alongside. In her personal life, Sydney was navigating the complexities of dating in the modern world. She was openly bisexual and used dating apps, including Tinder, to meet people. This was completely normal for someone her age in 2017. Dating apps had become mainstream, a standard way for young people to connect. Sydney lived with roommates and maintained close relationships with her family, particularly her mother. She wasn't reckless or careless. She was a normal 24-year-old woman living her life, working, dating, spending time with friends and family. In November 2017, Sydney matched on Tinder with someone using the name Audrey. The profile showed an attractive young woman with dark hair. They chatted through the app, and the conversation seemed normal, friendly, flirtatious. Audrey was actually Bailey Boswell, though Sydney didn't know that yet. Bailey suggested they meet up. Sydney agreed. On November 14, 2017, they went on their first date. The date seemed to go well enough that Sydney agreed to see Bailey again. She told friends about the date, sharing that she'd met someone new. The next evening, November 15, Sydney and Bailey made plans for a second date. Sydney was excited, looking forward to getting to know Bailey better. She got ready for the evening, told her roommates she was going out, and drove to meet Bailey. Around 6 p.m., Sydney sent a Snapchat to friends. The image showed her in a car, giving a thumbs up, appearing happy and relaxed. It was a casual message indicating things were going well. Her friends saw it and thought nothing unusual. Just Sydney on another date. But that Snapchat was the last time anyone heard from Sydney Loofe. When she didn't show up for work the next day, November 16th, her co-workers were concerned. Sydney was reliable. She didn't miss shifts without calling. They tried to contact her but got no response. By November 17th, Sydney's family was seriously worried. She hadn't been in contact, hadn't returned calls or messages, and this was completely unlike her. They reported her missing to the Lincoln Police Department. The police began investigating immediately. They obtained Sydney's phone records and dating app activity. They discovered she'd been communicating with someone named Audrey on Tinder. They identified the profile and began trying to locate this person. What they didn't know yet was that Sydney was already dead. That by the time her family reported her missing, her body had already been dismembered and disposed of in multiple locations across rural Nebraska. And that the people responsible were not just Bailey Boswell, but also her boyfriend Aubrey Trail, a man Sydney had likely never even known existed. To understand Sydney Loofe's murder, you must understand the twisted relationship between Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail. This was not a normal couple. This was a folie à deux, a shared psychosis, a relationship built on manipulation, control, and increasingly dark fantasies. Aubrey Trail was born in 1966, making him 51 years old in 2017. He had an extensive criminal history spanning decades. Fraud, theft, forgery, escape from custody. Trail was a career criminal who'd spent significant time in prison. He was a con artist by nature, someone who manipulated and deceived as easily as breathing. But Trail was more than just a criminal. He had grandiose delusions about himself. He believed he was special, chosen, destined for greatness. In the years before Sydney's murder, Trail had become obsessed with the idea of starting a sex cult. He wasn't just fantasizing about this. He actively recruited women, convinced them to move in with him, and attempted to build what he called his coven. Trail had a pattern. He would target young, vulnerable women, often those with troubled backgrounds or limited options. He would present himself as a mentor, a protector, someone who could offer them a better life. He would move them into his home, separate them from their families and friends, and gradually exert total control over them. He demanded complete obedience. He dictated what they wore, what they ate, who they could talk to. He created elaborate rules and hierarchies among the women. And he convinced them to participate in bizarre rituals and sexual activities, always positioning himself as the central figure, the master they must serve. Into this environment came Bailey Boswell in 2016. Bailey was in her early 20s, working as a sales clerk. She was attractive, outgoing, and according to those who knew her before meeting Trail, she was relatively normal. But she also had vulnerabilities that Trail exploited. The details of how Trail recruited Bailey aren't entirely clear, but what is clear is that within a short time, Bailey became completely devoted to him. She moved in with Trail and the other women in his coven. She adopted his worldview, his beliefs, his goals. She became, in the words of prosecutors, his most willing accomplice. Bailey's transformation was disturbing to those who'd known her before. Family members noticed she'd changed, that she seemed different, that she was isolated and secretive. But Bailey was an adult, making her own choices, and while concerning, there was no obvious crime being committed. Trail's control over Bailey was total. He dictated every aspect of her life. She called him Daddy. She obeyed his commands without question. She participated in his schemes and fantasies. And crucially, she became willing to help him recruit new women into the group. This is where Sydney Loofe entered the picture. Trail had decided he wanted to expand his group. He wanted more women, more followers, more people to control. Bailey was tasked with finding them. Using Tinder and other dating apps, Bailey would create profiles and match with women. She would chat with them, build rapport, and suggest meeting up. The goal was to evaluate potential recruits, to find women who might be vulnerable to Trail's manipulation, who might be convinced to join his group. But somewhere in this process, Trail's fantasies became darker. He began talking about sacrifices. He told Bailey and the other women that to gain supernatural powers, to achieve the next level of their spiritual journey, they needed to kill someone. He needed to prove his power through violence. Whether Trail genuinely believed this or whether it was simply an escalation of his controlling behavior is debated. But what's clear is that he convinced Bailey that murder was necessary. And Bailey, so completely under his control, agreed to help. The psychological dynamics at play here are complex. Bailey was not an innocent victim. She actively participated in planning and executing the murder. But she was also someone who'd been groomed, manipulated, and psychologically broken down by a skilled predator. Trail used classic cult leader techniques: isolation from family and friends, sleep deprivation, constant reinforcement of his authority, punishment for disobedience, and rewarding compliance. He created an environment where Bailey's entire reality was filtered through his worldview. But Bailey also made choices. She chose to stay. She chose to participate. She chose to create that Tinder profile and match with Sydney. She chose to go on those dates. And ultimately, she chose to participate in murder. This combination of victimization and agency makes Bailey Boswell a complicated figure in this case. The prosecution would argue she was a willing participant, fully culpable for her actions. The defense would argue she was under Trail's psychological control, unable to resist his influence. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, in the gray area where abuse and choice intersect, where someone can be both manipulated and responsible for their own actions. The exact details of Sidney Loofe's murder emerged gradually through the investigation, confessions, and trial testimony. What follows is based on evidence presented in court and statements made by the perpetrators. On November 15, 2017, Sidney Loofe drove to meet Bailey Boswell for their second date. Sidney believed she was meeting Bailey alone. She had no idea that Aubrey Trail was waiting, that this entire date was a setup, that she was walking into a trap. Bailey brought Sidney to an apartment in Wilbur, Nebraska, a small town about 35 miles southwest of Lincoln. This apartment was one of several properties Trail used, part of his network of locations where he conducted his illegal activities and controlled his group. When Sidney arrived, she was introduced to Trail. Bailey presented him as her friend or perhaps her roommate. The exact cover story isn't clear, but Sidney apparently didn't perceive immediate danger. She'd come to spend time with Bailey, and while the presence of this older man might have been unexpected, nothing suggested she felt threatened enough to leave. What happened next is where accounts diverge slightly, but the core facts are agreed upon by both perpetrators, though each blames the other for different aspects of the crime. According to later testimony, the evening progressed with conversation and drinking. Sidney may have been given something that impaired her, though toxicology was inconclusive due to the state of the remains when found. At some point, the situation turned violent. Trail claimed Bailey strangled Sidney with an extension cord. Bailey claimed Trail strangled her while Bailey held her down. Both admitted being present, both admitted participating, but each tried to minimize their own role while emphasizing the other's culpability. The reality is that Sidney Loofe was murdered by both of them working together. Whether Bailey or Trail struck the fatal blow is less important than the fact that they acted in concert, that this was a collaborative killing. Sidney fought for her life. There was evidence of a struggle. But against two people in a confined space, her chances were minimal. The strangulation was prolonged and brutal. Sidney likely suffered terribly in her final moments, understanding too late that she'd been betrayed, that the woman she trusted had lured her to her death. After Sidney was dead, Trail and Bailey faced the problem all killers face: what to do with the body. And their solution was one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. They decided to dismembrate Sidney's body, to cut it into pieces that could be more easily transported and hidden. This decision reveals the cold calculation at work. This wasn't panic or impulsive action. This was methodical problem-solving. Using tools purchased from a hardware store, they dismembered Sidney's body in a bathtub. The process took hours. It required sustained effort, continued commitment to the act even as the full horror of what they were doing must have been evident. Bailey and Trail then placed the body parts in garbage bags. They drove to rural areas around Wilbur and Clay Center, Nebraska, disposing of the bags in different locations along dirt roads and in ditches. They scattered the remains, hoping they wouldn't be found or that if they were, they couldn't be connected or identified. After disposing of Sidney's body, Trail and Bailey cleaned the apartment, removing evidence of the murder. They disposed of Sidney's belongings, including her clothing and personal items. They tried to eliminate any trace that she'd been there. But they made mistakes. They left digital evidence, phone records, GPS data, financial transactions. They'd been caught on surveillance cameras buying the tools used for dismemberment. And most significantly, they'd created a trail of communication between Bailey's Tinder profile and Sidney. As Sidney's family reported her missing and police began investigating, that digital trail led directly to Bailey Boswell. The investigation into Sidney Loofe's disappearance moved quickly once police identified Bailey Boswell as the last person to have contact with Sidney. On November 17, just 2 days after Sidney disappeared, police interviewed Bailey. She initially denied knowing Sidney or having met with her. But confronted with the Tinder messages and other digital evidence, she changed her story. Bailey admitted she'd been messaging Sidney and had met her once, but claimed Sidney had never shown up for their second date. She presented herself as confused about why police were asking about her, suggesting she barely knew Sidney. Police didn't believe her. The evidence showed Sidney had been with Bailey on November 15. Surveillance footage from various locations showed Bailey's vehicle traveling to areas that didn't match her story. Financial records showed purchases consistent with disposing of a body. As police increased pressure on Bailey, they also identified Aubrey Trail and began investigating his connection to the case. They discovered his criminal history, his unusual living situation with multiple women, and his relationship with Bailey. On November 27, Sydney's body was discovered. A farmer in rural Clay County found garbage bags containing human remains scattered along a dirt road. More remains were found in nearby areas. Forensic analysis confirmed these were Sydney Loofe's remains. The discovery of the body transformed the case from a missing person investigation to a murder investigation. The FBI became involved, given the interstate aspects of the case and the seriousness of the crime. On November 30, 2017, police arrested Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail. Both were charged with first-degree murder, improper disposal of human remains, and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrests didn't end the investigation, however. Police searched multiple properties connected to Trail, including the apartment in Wilbur where Sydney had been killed. They found evidence of the murder and dismemberment, blood traces that cleaning hadn't entirely removed, fibers matching those found with Sydney's remains, and tools used in the dismemberment. They also found disturbing materials that revealed the depth of Trail's delusions and the nature of his relationship with Bailey and the other women. There were writings about creating a cult, about gaining supernatural powers through sacrifice, about his belief that he was destined for greatness. Detectives interviewed the other women who'd been living with Trail. Their statements painted a picture of a man who exercised total control, who used psychological manipulation and intimidation to maintain dominance, and who'd been escalating toward violence for some time. As the case built toward trial, both Bailey and Trail gave statements to police. Initially, both denied involvement. But as evidence mounted, they began pointing fingers at each other. Trail claimed the murder was Bailey's idea, that she'd become obsessed with the idea of killing someone, that he tried to talk her out of it. He presented himself as a victim of Bailey's manipulation, an absurd claim given the power dynamics of their relationship. Bailey claimed she'd been terrified of Trail, that he'd threatened to kill her if she didn't help, that she'd felt she had no choice. She portrayed herself as another victim, manipulated and controlled by a master manipulator. The truth, as would become clear at trial, was that both were guilty, both had participated willingly, and both had their own psychological issues that contributed to the crime. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell were tried separately for Sydney Loofe's murder. Both trials would reveal disturbing details about the crime and the twisted relationship between the defendants. Aubrey Trail's trial began in June 2019. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt: phone records, GPS data, surveillance footage, forensic evidence from the murder scene, and testimony from witnesses including women who'd lived with Trail. Trail's defense attempted to shift blame entirely to Bailey, arguing she'd committed the murder and he'd only helped dispose of the body out of misguided loyalty. But this strategy failed to account for the extensive evidence of Trail's control over Bailey and his history of manipulation. During the trial, Trail engaged in bizarre behavior. He slashed his own throat in the courtroom, collapsing dramatically in front of the jury. Whether this was a genuine suicide attempt or a theatrical gesture designed to create grounds for mistrial is debated. He survived and the trial continued. The jury deliberated and found Aubrey Trail guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. In July 2019, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Trail was sentenced to death, becoming one of 11 people on Nebraska's death row. His appeals are ongoing, but his conviction appears solid given the overwhelming evidence. Bailey Boswell's trial came later, in October 2019. Her defense took a different approach, arguing she'd been psychologically controlled by Trail, that she was a victim of his manipulation, and that while she'd participated in disposing of Sydney's body, she hadn't been the one who killed her. The prosecution countered that Bailey was a willing participant who'd actively helped lure Sydney to her death. They presented evidence of Bailey's Tinder conversations, her role in planning the meeting, and testimony indicating she'd been an enthusiastic participant in Trail schemes. The jury found Bailey Boswell guilty on all counts. Like Trail, she was sentenced to death, though her sentence was later commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole when Nebraska's death penalty was abolished for crimes committed by women. The trials revealed psychological complexity that went beyond simple criminal prosecution. Expert witnesses testified about cult dynamics, about how skilled manipulators like Trail create environments where normal people can be convinced to do horrific things. But the trials also made clear that Bailey had agency, that she'd made choices, that she could have walked away at any point but didn't. She chose to stay with Trail. She chose to help him. She chose to participate in murder. For Sidney Loofe's family, the convictions brought some measure of justice but no real closure. Their daughter was gone, killed in a brutal and senseless way by people she trusted. No verdict could bring her back. Sidney's mother, Susie Loofe, became an advocate for online dating safety, speaking publicly about the dangers of meeting strangers online and the importance of staying vigilant. She's worked to keep Sidney's memory alive and to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The case also prompted discussions about how dating apps can be exploited by predators. While millions of people use these apps safely, Sidney's murder highlighted the risks, particularly for women meeting strangers. Dating app companies implemented or enhanced safety features following Sidney's case: verification systems, check-in features, emergency assistance buttons. But technology can only do so much. The fundamental risk of meeting strangers remains. Conclusion: the murder of Sidney Loofe reveals several disturbing truths about modern life. It shows how predators adapt to new technologies, using dating apps to find and groom victims. It demonstrates the psychological power of manipulative individuals and how they can convince others to participate in evil. Most fundamentally, it reminds us that evil often wears a friendly face. Bailey Boswell seemed normal, attractive, friendly. Sidney had no reason to suspect danger. She did what millions of people do. She swiped right, she chatted online, she agreed to a date. The difference between Sidney and countless others who've safely met partners through dating apps is luck, timing, and the random chance of matching with a predator instead of a normal person. Bailey and Aubrey's relationship exemplifies the dangerous dynamics of criminal couples. Research has shown that paired offenders often commit more serious crimes than they would alone. Each reinforces the other's deviant behavior, removing moral guardrails that might stop an individual acting alone. Trail was a predator who'd been honing his manipulation skills for decades. Bailey was vulnerable to his influence in ways that allowed her to be drawn into his twisted worldview. Together, they were capable of murder, of dismemberment, of disposing of a human being like garbage. Sidney Loofe deserved better. She deserved to live her life, to find love, to pursue her dreams. Instead, she encountered two people who saw her not as a human being but as a victim, a sacrifice, a means to an end in their delusional fantasies. Her memory lives on in her family's advocacy, in the changes made to dating app safety features, and in the consciousness of those who hear her story and resolve to be more careful, more aware, more vigilant about the dangers that can hide behind friendly profiles and attractive pictures. Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail will spend the rest of their lives in prison. They will never be free. But Sidney Loofe will never come home. And that imbalance, that fundamental injustice, is what makes this case so tragic. Be careful who you trust. Be wary of strangers, no matter how normal they seem. Tell people where you're going. Check in with friends. Trust your instincts. These are the lessons Sidney's death teaches us, bought at too high a price.